Hello, listeners, and welcome to another
Solarpunk Presents.
bonus chat. Today, Christina and I will be discussing our thoughts and reactions to the 1984 Studio Ghibli classic Nausicaä of the Valley of the Wind.
Before we go on, let me remind you that we need and appreciate your support. So join our Patreon, subscribe to our YouTube channel, leave a comment, and give us likes. Thank you. And now let's talk about Nausicaä of the Valley of the Wind. The version in original Japanese with English subtitles. Of course, because, I don't know, something just gets lost when they dub movies. So, even though I can't understand more than about 5 words of Japanese, including things like sushi, having subtitles alongside the original voices somehow conveys more of the intent and emotions of the movie. And I find this so much better. Having made the mistake about 20 years ago of seeing the dubbed version of Princess Mononoke and finding it absolutely flat and awful.
I found that even the subtitles in this film were, I'm not a translator, so I'm sure they were working to make Japanese idioms and reactions more culturally legible to a Western audience. But there were some instances where I knew they definitely weren't saying what the subtitles were telling me, and some nuance was lost because of it.
I'm just flashing back to when I saw The City of God. I don't know if you saw that movie. It was a Brazilian movie. It's in Portuguese. It takes place in a favela mostly. And I'm watching the subtitles and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, they're translating everything that's being said as, probably it was like fuck or something like that. But I'm like, what they're saying in Portuguese, not that I speak Portuguese, but is a lot more interesting than just that one word. Okay. Anyways, but what's your example for Nausicaä?
Well, it's a really simple example. But like when Nausicaä first meets up with Lord Yupa, she sometimes addresses him as sensei or Yupa sensei, which tells you a lot more about their relationship. Like not only is he a friend of her father's, but she also sees him as her teacher and accords him that respect. It's a bit vague, like was he her teacher only, or is he a teacher of a lot of people? Like that's his title, and what did he teach her?
The movie makes a big deal about him being the best swordsman ever. So, probably swordplay, combat, that kind of stuff.
I'm not fluent in Japanese, so I can't like give you an accurate assessment of subtitle accuracy throughout the entire movie. I just have whatever I remember from living there almost 15 years ago. So that's pretty much the only example that comes off the top of my head right now.
Well, I mean, it is hard to translate some things from one language to another because there's just words that some languages have and concepts that some languages have and other ones don't.
Yeah.
But this talk about sensei here is making me think, when Darth Vader says, "The last time we met, you were the master," in a totally different light from
Oh,
Star Wars, when he meets Ben Kenobi in the Death
yeah,
Star.
I know.
And because suddenly, obviously, to me now, master must be George Lucas's translation of sensei. And I have no idea why that never occurred to me before.
Ah.
But anyways, critiquing subtitles and Star Wars isn't really what we're here to do. Let's talk about the actual movie Nausicaä itself, and maybe about Studio Ghibli as a whole a bit, since Solarpunks are really enthusiastic about pretty much all of the movies that Ghibli has put out. And we could also talk about whether or not Nausicaä is a Solarpunk film, which is to say, sure, the movie is totally Solarpunk in spirit, but I don't think it's a Solarpunk movie, if that makes sense, at least not in the strict sense of the term Solarpunk as I understand it, at any rate in reference to science fiction.
Okay. Let's back up a little bit. Let's give a little précis of the actual movie first, and then we'll move on to what we think. How about that?
Okay, all right. So for those of you who may not have seen it, and I hadn't ever before last week, and spoilers for a movie that's 40 years old at this point, and oh my God, the cell animation. I hadn't seen a movie with cell animation in years, and boy, did that ever make me nostalgic.
Same. Like the painted backgrounds in particular reminded me a lot of my childhood favorite movies, like Land Before Time and Fern Gully, and even the Disney 90s movies still had a bit of those, though by that time they were moving away from that style of animation, it seems.
It's a lot of work to paint all those bits of celluloid.
There.
But I like it because, somehow there's a depth to the film that you don't get even with the more modern types of animation. But anyways, I'm not an expert on that, so I'm going to stop going there. So anyway, again, spoilers ahead. Although knowing what happens won't actually spoil the movie for you. But Nausicaä is the story of Nausicaä, or Nausicaä, or however you say it, who is, as far as I can tell, the perfect human being. She's young, beautiful, and a princess, no less. And she's kind and respectful to all life, plant, animal, human, and presumably otherwise.
She can fly a glider better than anyone and fly an airplane that she's never been in before.
And she can fight like a master or a sensei or whatever you want to call that, with a sword or a gun.
Plus, she's great at gardening and basically in understanding everything about the world around her. So, she's a scientist, actually, who runs experiments in her own lab under the castle, as we come to see.
Well, very kind experiments, right?
Yes.
You could even call her an insect whisperer if you wanted, and everyone loves her.
And she manages all of this while standing up for herself and her people and never morally compromising herself. Except for that one time.
Yeah.
I said except for that one time, but we'll get into that.
And she's simply fearless, having clearly never faced a situation in her entire life that she wasn't up to succeeding in.
If more teenagers in this world were like Nausicaä, it would definitely be a different place.
Oh, well, not just teenagers. But yeah, totally, right? I mean, what a great world it would be.
Mm-hmm.
But Nausicaä's world is not a great world. It's an environmentally devastated one, where small settlements of people try to eke a living out of the soil while avoiding inhaling toxic pollutants, while fending off the encroaching toxic forests that spell the end of human settlements in an area when they move in, and while fighting off angry hordes of gigantic insects, like the giant trilobite-like ohms, who have so many eyes they can pretty much see everything.
Nausicaä's people have been thriving in their isolated valley in the wake of an apocalypse 1,000 years earlier, which everyone refers to as the 7 Days of Fire, which destroyed civilization, laid waste to ecosystems, and did this contamination of the entire world. But this precarious situation collapses when Nausicaä's kind and decent people get dragged into a new war between two of their neighbors, the Tolmekians and the Pejite.
Ah, that's how you say that. Funny, I heard the whole movie and I couldn't tell you how to pronounce that word. Anyways, the former, the Tolmekians, are power-hungry and aggressive. And the latter, how did you say that?
Pejite? That's how they say it in the movie.
Okay, so. Pejite. Yeah, I'm just useless. The latter possess the last remaining superweapon, a slumbering giant warrior, left over from the war that destroyed civilization and contaminated the world.
The Tolmekians want to use the giant warrior to destroy Pejite and the toxic forest and reestablish human dominance over the planet. The Pejitans, people from Pejite, also want to destroy the toxic forest and take back control over the planet.
But Nausicaä and her people, and I don't know what they're called, the people who live in the Valley of the Wind?
It's kind of a mouthful. The people from the Valley of the Wind, or the people of the valley.
Okay.
The people of the valley.
Anyways, Nausicaä and her people just want to live in peace, even if that means coexisting with the toxic forest and its poisons and all those tempestuous insects.
It's a pretty standard Studio Ghibli theme, honestly, about the necessity for humans and nature to coexist and not throw things off kilter by one trying to eradicate the other. So usually it's about the humans trying to take over and establish dominance over nature.
Which doesn't end up happening in this movie. Instead, Nausicaä stops the fighting of people versus insect, and of people versus toxic forest by understanding nature's attempts to heal the world from the destruction that humanity hath wrought. Through her heroic feats and a final massive act of bravery and self-sacrifice, Nausicaä gets everyone to see the error of their ways and to stop fearing the natural world around them. Without her having to tell them to do so, the people lay down their weapons, stop fighting with each other, and stop trying to fight nature.
And then everybody lives happily ever after, including the marching army of gigantic, multi-eyed, segmented insects prone to murderous fits of literal red-seeing rage.
Clearly, there's a lot going on in this film. And it has a lot to say about humanity's relationship with and abuse of the natural world.
It's got a pretty strong anti-war theme going on too, and a lot to say about behaving nobly and with respect towards others, while at the same time having no fear of telling someone that what they're doing is stupid and horrible when it is truly stupid and horrible.
It's kind of like the situation we're in today, where we have all of these environmental things we need to fix, and all we can do is keep fighting with each other. Yeah, war is stupid, and it's a terrible distraction. And I was also quite struck by how much the film was about the way women get things done, and about the different perspective they have on the world than, say, the sort of men who need to dominate and control everything.
Future Ariel dropping in to mention that the film also shows younger and older people of all genders getting things done in their own ways that aren't according to the domineering ways of toxic masculinity that always resorts to violence. So where do we even start in on all of that?
Yeah, I have no idea. Except that I'd love to get a couple of things off my chest before we dive into themes.
Okay. Go for it.
So as I was watching it, I was struck by how much the film looked like a manga novel. And so not just in the style of the drawings, but also in the framing of the shots. And so I thought, well, maybe this started off life as a manga novel. So I did a shallow bit of internet sleuthing. And I was, kind of pleased to discover that Nausicaä was indeed initially a manga series, written and illustrated by none other than Hayao
Miyazaki.
I'm always transposing. That ran from 1982 until 1994. Also, I was surprised to learn that the initial inspiration for the setting of the story was not the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but the horrible environmental disaster that unfurled in Minamata Bay in Japan during the 20th century.
Oh, wow. I assumed that because the references to the 7 Days of Fire in the movie, that it was definitely about nuclear war. But I mean, thinking about it again, there are a lot of different ways for the Earth to become toxic and poisoned aside from nuclear radiation. I just assumed that the ohms and the other bugs were all just giant mutated things because of nuclear radiation. But I mean, sadly, there's a lot more toxins in the world, I suppose, that can maybe do stuff like that.
Yeah, so the characters spend a lot of time trying not to inhale or otherwise come into contact with this toxic materials, whereas, radiation, you don't need to actually touch it for it to be a problem.
Well, yeah, true. But I mean, I would say that most nuclear apocalypse, post-apocalypse stories don't tend to pay very much attention to actual science when it comes to how nuclear radiation affects things. I'm just saying it. There's artistic license that is taken in pretty much every representation of nuclear fallout. So
okay.
I had just kind of gone along with it. But anyway, sorry, continue.
Oh, no. So to put a long story as short as I possibly can, which is to say probably not very short, in 1908, the Chizo Corporation founded a chemical factory in Minamata, in Japan. And times being what they were, and chemists being chemists, dilution is the solution to pollution, and all that.
That is the cutest little rhyme.
Oh, it is so horrible, though. But they all say it. They all say it. Anyways, the firm got into the habit of releasing the waste from the production of fertilizers and a number of organic chemicals. And by this, I don't mean anything to do with organic farming, but with the branch of chemistry that involves carbon-carbon and carbon-hydrogen bonds, straight into the local bay.
Oh, right, of course, because that will just make it go away. And
yeah.
It'll just disappear into the ocean and never have any consequences, I guess.
Right, exactly. So far, so bad, but it gets worse. So in 1932, the Chiso, and I don't know if I'm saying that correctly.
I think it should be Chiso.
Chiso, okay.
Yeah.
The Chiso Corporation's factory started producing acetaldehyde, an important precursor for a number of other useful chemicals, such as acetic acid, and the precursors to vinyl acetate and polyvinyl acetate, which you probably know better as Elmer's glue or wood glue.
Wait, is Elmer's glue and wood glue exactly
they are? Elmer's glue is just a brand name.
I have learned a thing. Thank you, Christina.
And this set the stage for the disaster to come, because they used mercury sulfate as the catalyst for the reaction that produced acetaldehyde. But bad, still about to get worse. In 1951, the factory switched to a different co-catalyst, and that resulted in the mercury sulfate getting turned into methylmercury, which is an extremely bioavailable, bioaccumulating, extremely potent toxin.
I'm just saying, I think like even I have heard of how that name and how terrible it is.
There are still worse things, like dimethylmercury is way, way worse. But anyway, methylmercury, anything with methyl on it is going to get into biology, and get into your tissues, and you're going to take it up and use it because it's so easy to cleave off that methyl group. Anyway, so cue tons and tons of methylmercury getting flushed out into Minamata Bay between 1951 and 1968. So the shellfish in the bay, who were always, filter feeding, took this methylmercury up out of the water and accumulated in their tissues. Or possibly what they ate were particles of plankton that had taken up the methylmercury, or perhaps they just ended up filtering some debris that the methylmercury had stuck onto. At any rate, it ends up inside the tissues of the shellfish. And then people ate the shellfish.
Oh no.
Yeah. By 1956, the first case of Minamata disease appeared in a 5-year-old girl who was having trouble walking and speaking and was having convulsions. The second case, which was her sister, showed up 2 days later.
Oh, that must have been so terrifying and awful. Like both for the little girls, but also for their parents.
I mean, I think they lived through it. I don't know what repercussions it's had for the rest of their life, but it definitely could have done permanent neurological damage. And they didn't even have it as bad as some people would come to have this Minamata disease. So in general, the symptoms include lack of coordination, numbness, problems with hearing and speech. In severe cases, there can be paralysis, insanity, you can slip into a coma, you can even die within weeks of the onset of symptoms.
Wow.
Yeah, mercury poisoning is nothing to sneeze at. And, I thought this was interesting because this is a little bit like what's portrayed in the film Nausicaä for the characters who are toxified by this lifetime of exposure to the toxins, right? They start to lose the use of their hands, they end up bedridden. In the real world, it only took the authorities until 1956 to identify mercury poisoning as the problem. Since humanity has a pretty long history of poisoning itself with mercury, Mad as a Hatter and all that, the symptoms have been known for a while. By 1959, they'd made enough measurements for it to be clear that mercury levels in Minamata Bay were sky high. And this also immediately implicated the chemical factory that was pumping wastewater into the bay, and of course, had to know it was using mercury sulfate as this catalyst, so it was the most feasible source of the mercury.
Right.
But thanks to denial, lies, subterfuge, and greenwashing, it wasn't until 1968 that the Chiso Corporation stopped using mercury sulfate as a catalyst during its production of acetaldehyde. And meanwhile, probably at least 20,000 people have suffered from mercury poisoning because of this, with nothing to say of the bay, which will remain contaminated with mercury for centuries.
Sadly, it's very reminiscent of the way that in the days after the March 2011 earthquake, whenever I would talk to my students about what was going on, they'd bluntly tell me that they weren't sure even what the newscasters were saying because the government was clearly lying and trying to cover up how bad things were. My students were adults, by the way, like this was coming from like 40, 50-year-old people. It was not reassuring.
Hey, hang on, let's backtrack a bit, because I know some things about you, but probably not all of our listeners do. So March 2011 earthquake, students, where are you? What are you doing? Which earthquake are you talking about?
I can't remember whether or not I've said this on the podcast yet or not, but I was living in Japan. So I was teaching English to adults in Nagoya, Japan. And during that time, I was there when the whole giant earthquake and consequent sort of Fukushima reactor meltdown happened.
Oh yeah, the horrific tsunami.
I mean, like I was in Nagoya, which was pretty far away from the epicenter of the earthquake. So luckily there wasn't a whole lot. I mean, like we had some pretty severe aftershocks to the point where like I was surprised that nothing was badly destroyed in our city. Yeah, I mean, like all of my students had, like family up in those prefectures, and like a lot of them would, like pack up their suitcases full of, supplies and head out there for the weekend just to like help their families and stuff like that. And it was a big mess.
Okay, it was terrifying. And it's surprising to hear that they mishandled it a bit because, normally one thinks of the Japanese as being very on top of things and very proud of doing a good job. In the wake of Chernobyl, which it was all about deny, 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 deny. And the only
Well, here
reason,
there was a little bit of that as well, because I mean the Japanese are really big on saving face, right? So like they didn't want to admit that it was as bad as it was and that they couldn't control the situation, the heads of the Fukushima nuclear reactor especially. So there was that going on. I speak Japanese, but it's like baby Japanese. Like it's like the level of a 6-year-old, basically. So, I mean, newscasts were just beyond me. They go way too fast and have so many complicated words. And so I found it very, very difficult to keep up with, like what every day there was new news on what was going on, right? And I just had no idea. So I would ask my students, and then they would tell me, like, well, you can't really trust what the TV says, even if you can understand it. And I was like, great, that's awesome, cool. I am just going to keep living my life and hope I don't die of radiation poisoning, which I
okay.
didn't. So,
Yeah, no, that's good. No, I mean, so, here in Europe, there was the whole Chernobyl thing. And if it wasn't for the fact that people were monitoring radiation, nobody would have necessarily ever known what had happened.
mm,
And this is really bad because you've got the fallout coming down everywhere. I have a
yeah.
friend who's I have a lot of friends who are oceanographers because I was an oceanographer, and she was out on the Baltic, and they do work with carbon 14 and other
Mm,
of these radioisotopes, so they can keep track of how fast phytoplankton are photosynthesizing, for example. And so they have Geiger counters, and they're like, oh, background radiation has gone up. What's going on?
uh-huh.
In the because she was out on the Baltic in the wake of Chernobyl, and so they had fallout coming down around them, and there's nothing in the news at that point. So they're like,
Yeah.
what, what has happened? And it's terrible. And so, and my other half was growing up in East Germany, and there was complete denial. There's no problems. There's no problems. There's no problems. And so, at the time, if you were feeding your children milk, for instance, it's full of radioactive iodine,
Yikes.
right? And so you don't want to be feeding them milk for like 2 weeks after
No
uh,
kidding.
something like that, right? Because it
Yeah.
ends up in the grass, and then the cows eat it, and then it ends up in the milk.
Yeah,
And
sure.
then people end up with thyroid problems.
Yeah, I mean, like, in the grocery store, I was like, I don't know what is from Fukushima Prefecture or not because I cannot read kanji. And so it was difficult. I was like, okay, so I know the rice is probably contaminated, but I don't know like I don't know what greens are safe to eat or that sort of stuff. Like in the immediate wake of the whole nuclear reactor meltdown, it was kind of like, well, I don't really understand how this science works, to be honest. I was like, I don't really know if like if I consume something from the prefecture of Fukushima generally, or if I just consume something that was from like a town near the reactor. I
Well, see, it's
There
this
was a
problem
lot
with
of
radiation, right? It's invisible and more or
yeah.
less undetectable, unless it's
Hmm.
so concentrated that it's you're getting a burn from it. But and
Yeah.
so you have to trust that the authorities are making sure that they're taking samples and putting them in, doing putting them in the gamma counter, or using the Geiger counter to make sure that this stuff is safe, because you don't want to incorporate radioactive material into your bones, or
Yeah.
into
And at
or
a
into your
time of
tissues.
crisis, you really do need to trust the authorities to like, like if they say there's a tsunami coming. You have to trust that that is true so that you like get out of Dodge, and save your own life,
Yeah.
right? Instead of just holding your ground and being like, oh, it's fine, But then if there's doubt being cast on whether or not what the authorities are communicating to you is true or not, then, you don't really know how you're supposed to act. And anyways, I'm
Yeah,
getting a little
it's a huge
far
theme.
away.
But this is also this is a huge theme. And it's also good to have international agencies. It's good to have lots of
Oh,
people who lots of scientists or whatever who are independent who can chime in on this kind of stuff and to build confidence and to, construct a picture of what the hell is going on.
yeah, for sure. I mean, in 2011, like we had like, I mean, there was no denying that something bad happened because there was just all of this footage of the tsunami and of the meltdowns and of the earthquake damage. And like it wasn't, like the physical aspects of it could not be covered up, right? And so, like, I'm just thinking in terms of like the film Nausicaa, like they don't have, social media or an internet.
Or
And
Geiger
so,
counters.
or Geiger
Or
counters
anything
or
to measure
anything, like
mercury.
so in the middle of the film, Nausicaa finds out that actually the forest is toxic because the earth is toxic. But if the trees and plants and stuff like that are actually, being fed pure water and pure soil, then they're not toxic and you can totally breathe around them and it's fine. But she isn't able to communicate that to anyone except for Lord Yupa, and they were very distracted by the fallout of her father's literal murder and like the takeover of their entire valley by the Tolmekians at the time. Like it wasn't really a priority to get that news out at the time. It's not like there was a news reporter being like, so, like I need to communicate this to everybody, and that's how everybody will know that the toxic forest is actually a good thing, So
Anyway, so the bottom line is that the Minamata mercury pollution disaster, not all the radiation and destruction of the use of nuclear weapons, did I just say nuclear? God, nuclear weapons was Miyazaki's inspiration for the toxic landscape in Nausicaa, and Nausicaa the film.
Ah, okay. Well, I did a bit of reading up on themes myself and found out that weirdly, whenever critics have pointed out the heavy environmental, feminist, and anti-war themes that run throughout Nausicaa, Miyazaki has tended to deny them, saying that he was just trying to entertain people. And, it's not that big of he didn't write that.
I can understand maybe why he denies that because, he's not, because it is an entertaining film. And you wouldn't want to be turned off to hear, oh God, there's all these heavy environmental themes and feminism or anything like that. Nausicaa, the movie, is very engaging and it's a very moving movie. And, I think after seeing it, I definitely want to be as excellent, admirable, powerful, and effective in my pure-hearted, sympathetic courage as Nausicaa, the character, is. Maybe someday when I finally grow up.
It's a fun movie to watch. There's so much action and plenty to be outraged about, but also plenty to be excited about. So it's pretty impressive, actually, when you consider that this was the second ever film that Miyazaki did, and the first one that is actually his and not based on other IP. So it really sets down a lot of the themes that his movies spend the next 40 years exploring. To your point about its focus on the agency of women, that's one theme that goes through almost all of the Ghibli movies, at least that I've seen. So he's big into showing the agency of older women. Miyazaki was really close to his mother, if I recall correctly. And he's into showing the agency of girls, young people, old people, and animals and nature. Just basically all the non-traditional heroes is what he tells stories about.
Yeah, I have to admit, so I've probably seen 3 Studio Ghibli films, maybe 4, possibly 4. I may have seen My Neighbor Totoro a billion years ago.
Mm.
But all the ones I know for sure that I've seen have had female protagonists, or young girl protagonists for the most part. But Nausicaa, the film, is definitely a collision of agencies. I mean, everybody has agency. The insects are angry about the way they're being treated, and they're on the march. The queen or princess or whatever it was, the commander and soldiers of the Tolmekians, she wants to conquer the world. The warriors of the Pajite, yeah, those people, they want revenge and they want their weapon of mass destruction back. But the women of Pajite want to honor Nausicaa's kindness to their fallen princess. And, so they help her to escape so she can stop their own warriors from waging war on Nausicaa's people. I mean, even the young children get into it. The young girls amongst Nausicaa's people, who totally adore her, before she sets off on her journey, they collect nuts for her to take with her, which I guess is a pretty arduous task. And, it feeds her along the way. It really helps her in a time of need. And everyone in the valley turns to the old Kroon character, whose name I didn't catch, for advice, wisdom, and folklore about the situations they're facing. So, even though the story is definitely Nausicaa's hero's journey, in which the treasure she brings back to her people, as well as stopping the wars and all that, is the knowledge of how the world is healing itself from humanity's horrible wounds. Everybody and their own personalities and flaws and desires and quirks is pitching in to make her task either easier or more complicated.
Pretty much. Like she and all the people living in the Valley of the Wind, they already have to be careful coexisting with insects from the toxic forest because theirs is a pretty deadly agency that they have to live with from day to day. And when they're not being used as pawns in a war between their aggressive neighbors, Nausicaa's people are actually pretty good at the whole business of leaving well enough alone when it comes to non-human beings who are both incredibly simple and incredibly powerful. So again, another strong theme in Ghibli movies is living with and respecting nature and recognizing that non-human nature is powerful in its own ways that humans have a really hard time understanding, and yet they're a really integral part of how the world works.
So, having never been to Japan, I may have no idea what I'm talking about, but this respect for nature, not just as an inanimate thing, but as a collection of spirited beings, each with its own thoughts, emotions, and right to exist, has always struck me as being an incredibly Japanese perspective on the world. I mean, not that they're all environmental saints or anything. See, for instance, the Minamata mercury poisoning disaster. But this really does feel like a strong thread running through the Japanese culture.
As I see it, this relates directly back to the Shinto religious tradition of Japan, which is very tied to the divinity of the land and its flora and fauna, and it demands a pretty deep respect from humans since every part of their environment is sacred. So either it's the representation of a god itself, or protected by a god. Although God technically isn't really the right term, but there's not a good translation in English, and that's where I'm going to leave it at, because that's the extent to which my firsthand experience of Japanese culture plus my undergrad minor in religion takes me. So anything else I say is going to be pretty shaky.
Animism, right?
Yeah,
so
kind
even though I'm irreligious and an atheist and a scientist to boot, I love the idea of animism. It's beautiful to look at the world and even in the entire universe as filled with, I'm not sure what to call it, spiritual essences? Oh God, that sounds so cheesy. And yet, would it hurt if we treated the environment and all the non-human life and even inanimate objects with respect, acknowledging the sacred within them? Although I'm not even sure if we manage this with other people. Yeah, but human beings are also trickier, as I can tell you after spending the weekend at my mother-in-law's. But anyways, who amongst us doesn't feel, at least sometimes, like the objects around us, or the environment itself, or the forces of nature are animate and possessed of their own free will and, lots of opinions.
Mm.
But to get back to Nausicaä.
Yeah, to get back to Nausicaa, I think it's worth pointing out that since this was Miyazaki's first movie based on his own ideas and second movie ever, that might be the reason that he wasn't really super subtle in his writing either. Like, he can deny it all he wants, but it's really not hard at all to pluck out a whole bunch of themes from the movie because viewers don't really have to dig. It's all there on the surface.
Also, even though the movie deals with a lot of really complex problems, somehow it all works out in the end. But yeah, I was torn about this. On the one hand, it's as, subtle as a kid's movie.
I mean, it kind of makes sense for the genre of a kid's movie, I guess. It functions less as a real life story and more like a fairy tale or a fable, where a majority of the characters are like stock archetypes or they fit a certain function. And then there's a happy ending once the single main issue is resolved. I'm not anti-happy ending, by the way. Like, this is a Solarpunk podcast after all.
And yet, this isn't exactly a movie for little kids. A lot of people get shot and sliced and hacked to death in the film. And I'm pretty sure the marauding army of angry ohms with their glaring red eyes would have terrified the bejeebies out of me when I was a little kid. I mean, the monsters in Scooby-Doo used to terrify me when I was a little kid. And I like to think this is because it doesn't really take much to terrify little kids, and not that it was just me.
Well, I think that some kids can handle a lot more than what we give them credit for what it's worth. So maybe there were some kids who didn't have the bejeebies scared out of them by that. I don't know. But maybe I'm also falling into the Western assumption that if a film is animated, it must be for children.
Oh my God, you never saw Sausage Party then?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's not really true, but it hobbled a lot of anime and creative work from the rest of the globe that happened to be animated up until like really recently, and maybe even still. So I take that comment about it being a kids' movie back. It's more of a genre of like a fable, but not necessarily one for children only.
Oh, definitely not. Yeah. So, on the other hand, even though Nausicaä suffers a little bit from a first work syndrome in that all the ideas are in there, I was happy to see it didn't simply trot along well-worn tropey paths. Like, when the guy in the fighter plane shows up, I'm like, oh no, it's Nausicaa's inevitable love interest. You know, because she's a princess after all, right? And then the film didn't go there.
Yeah.
And Lord Yupa, with his legendary fighting skills, I mean, everyone is in awe of this guy, right? He could have been the guy who saves the day with his swordplay. But in the end, he's only important because he's been wandering the earth trying to find the savior of the people, you know, the guy from the prophecies who will come and lead everyone to a clean and beautiful paradise. And then in the end, it isn't even Lord Yupa who spots this foreseen person. It's actually the blind old crone.
I think there's something very ironic in the fact that she, like sees what he does not see.
Yeah, but but she's also the keeper of the ancient wisdom on some level,
Well,
right?
that's true. So,
Still, it is his quest and he doesn't see it. So, anyways, sorry. Then, in the end, even if everything ends up incredibly rapidly wrapped up with a neat little bow, it's still a warm and quite a deeply moving movie. Right? I had some pretty major doubts at the beginning as the story was very slowly taking shape. But honestly, by the time I was halfway through, or maybe even a quarter of the way through watching it, I was fully invested. So, subtle or not, rather complicated or not, the movie kind of works. It really works. So, it's pretty clear why Solarpunks and other people too like this film. The setting may be far future and fantasy, and the characters, for the most part, honestly, with the exception of the Tolmekian queen, who kind of struck me as being the most real person in the film, aside from that, the characters are the stock of fables. Although, actually, also this Tolmekian queen also works as a fable character as well. Anyways, the solar punkish messages are there. Respect for the earth and all its inhabitants, and presumably this is happening on Earth. Fight for what you believe is worth fighting for. Never give up, never surrender. Always be cheerful. Try to see the best in everyone. Never give up hope. But every time I say there just hasn't been any Solarpunk movie made, everyone frowns at me and says Studio Ghibli, or however you say it. And I'm sorry, but I stand by my statement. This is not a Solarpunk movie. Stricto sensu. And sorry, that's the nerdy scientist in me using a nerdy Latin phrase that means in the strictest sense, in this case of the term.
Oh, I didn't know that one. Nice. But yeah, I think Nausicaä, is more proto-solarpunk than anything. Like it has a lot of the elements of a solarpunk story, both in the way it's portrayed and what the story tells us, but doesn't quite get there. Like, for example, there's this mix of high tech and basically feudal technology. The Valley of the Wind has these cool planes and gliders whose fuel is never specified, but is probably something from the toxic forest. But they also rely heavily on windmills to bring up water from deep underground to drink and irrigate crops, which they farm by hand still. They combat the spores from the toxic forest with flamethrowers, but the valley still has a really agricultural or rural feel, with a castle and a keep reminiscent of medieval Europe. And then when we eventually see Pejite, or at least the main city of it. We see a medieval city that's more like Istanbul in the Middle Ages.
Oh,
That's
and
what it looks like.
everybody's got these gas mask filter, particulate filter things.
Yeah, where did those come from?
Yeah.
And why are they the same across cultures?
Oh yeah, the Pajite people or had something that looked a little different.
Oh, yeah, okay,
You
fair.
know, because Nausicaa, hers had these little doggy flaps hanging down.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, you're right.
So
Okay.
so there were some cultural differences in the
Yeah,
air filters.
you're right.
This kind of mishmash of high tech and low tech actually does seem pretty solar punk to me, even if it in the movie is a bit on the lower tech side of things. What doesn't seem solar punk to me is that the film setting is in the far future and not in the near future. But solar punk sits within the mundane sci-fi Venn diagram bubble.
Hmm.
Also, the film follows from some sort of horrible environmental apocalypse where everything has been destroyed and civilization has collapsed. That's a no-no in solar punk storytelling, if you want to be nitpicky about it. Solar punk's about how we don't have to go through the apocalypse first before screwing our heads on straight and making our economies and ways of life sustainable.
But the themes that we talked about before of the agency of non-dominant groups and the fact that nature has agency and is never subjected to human domination, but instead is respected in the end, those are some pretty solar punk themes.
So is the emphasis on community and communal decision making, at least in the Valley of the Wind. Like they have a royal family, but the community comes together to make big decisions about the community itself, especially after Nausicaa's father is murdered.
That actually reminds me, I wanted to talk about how, after that scene in the movie, Nausicaa tells Lord Yupa that she kind of scared herself when she saw her father dead, and then she went on a killing spree for a few minutes. She specifically says she's afraid of her own rage because she doesn't want to kill anyone, which I think is worth pausing on because I think
Um,
it's a.
I,
Oh,
I just
yeah.
I just want to inject a word of defense on Nausicaa's part. It's not that just that she saw her father dead, but she saw her father had just been murdered.
Yes. Yeah.
And the
Yes.
people were standing there. The
Yeah.
soldiers were
Yeah. Like it
standing
had
there.
just happened. And yeah, I
And
mean,
he
it's
was
completely
helpless and
understandable.
bedridden.
Yeah. Yeah. It's completely understandable. But like Nausicaa at first is shown to us as this incredibly perfect teenage girl who's super capable and knowledgeable and always does the right thing, right up until that one moment when she's so angry that she betrays her own pacifist morals and kills a bunch of enemy soldiers instead of slipping away. Like she could have become a rebel leader or a guerrilla warfare princess, or at least taken a moment to think very deeply about how to solve the situation without bloodshed. And she probably would have found a way because she's pretty brilliant. But she suddenly became tunnel visioned and didn't think about the consequences of her actions at all the moment that she became too angry to think reasonably. And this mirrors the first time that we see a live Ohm, actually, and how Nausicaa is the one to keep it from killing Lord Yupa. And she does this not by destroying the Ohm, but by distracting it and talking to it long enough that it's able to calm down, think about the situation, and decide that it would rather just go back home and not kill Lord Yupa. So the message that I get here is that the Ohm are naturally peaceful, like how Nausicaa is extremely pacifist, like to the point of her own suffering and death, when she's in her right mind. But when she's not, she's lethal and she hates it. To her, it's a mark of weakness, not something to be impressed by, because she's seen how when the Ohm are enraged, they take actions that make no sense and they become very stupid in their reactions. And she doesn't want to be like that.
And she does pretty much go through the rest of the movie without killing anyone, doesn't she? She does really
Yeah.
solve all the problems in other ways.
Yeah.
Even when that's totally counterintuitive and counter to what we would expect.
Yeah.
Um,
So like we have this feel like she can kill people. She's very perfectly capable of doing it and she's scarily competent at it, but she decides not to. And I think that's really important. Just because someone is peaceful doesn't mean that they are weak.
a pushover. No, yeah. I mean, it's very hard to be pacifist because people walk all over you or walk all over your country. So, right, you have to be able to stand up for yourself. This whole while, and while I was watching the movie, I've been hung up on the word ohm, which is written in the subtitles as OHM, right? Which is, the name of the symbol of electrical resistance. But when you say it out loud, it sounds like Om, that sound of meditation. And not only is this a syllable that can calm your brain and presumably also your blood pressure when repeated as a mantra, it's considered a sacred sound.
Yeah, like according to Wikipedia, it's an invocation in Hinduism. So, like in short, the sound Om is the essence of the supreme absolute consciousness, Atman, Brahman, or the cosmic world. And in Indic traditions, Om serves as a sonic representation of the divine.
That's some pretty hefty symbolism for a giant pill bug-like bug with big angry eyes.
Well, hey, maybe Miyazaki actually wasn't thinking about that when he named the giant, intelligent, semi-divine protectors of the toxic forest that actually gives humans the pure water they need to live and is in the process of purifying the planet after the sonic representation of the divine, but it sure feels like it's not a coincidence. But I think in this case, he doth protest too much. It's a little bit too on the nose in terms of naming.
Now I'm trying to decide if ohms have noses. So they sort of have mandibles. So, the whole film opens with how the people use the ohm's discarded shells. The people of the Valley of the Wind use these discarded shells because, these are invertebrates, and when they grow, they have to shed their exoskeleton.
Mm-hmm.
So they use this material, which is incredibly hard, to make weapons and tools and all kinds of things. So it's not like there aren't some people in the movie who recognize their symbiotic relationship with the insects, as dangerous as they are, right? They really depend on them.
Yeah, so we have another Solarpunk theme of rising above our base natures to choose to see the good in others and act for the betterment of the community here. That's what I'm seeing anyway.
I'm still only happy to call it a movie rife with Solarpunk sentiments.
Maybe it has to do with how it doesn't feel super plausible. Like it feels more like a fantasy movie, like in an alternate universe instead of a possible outcome of today's society.
Yeah, those giant warriors were definitely something we don't have. But I don't think it is supposed to be realistic. Even if 1,000 years in the future, a lot could happen between now and then. Although 1,000 years would be incredibly fast for evolution to cough up the ohms and all the fantastical plant and animal creatures of the toxic forest, even with, a lot of mutations.
I'm very used to the literary and film convention of like radiation did it, hand wave. It's like how in fantasy, it's like a wizard did it, hand wave. You don't have to really think about it, but you make a very good point. So it still isn't grounded in anything that we know to be true about science right now, and even about radiation and toxic poisoning. Like maybe in the early 80s in Japan, it felt really possible, this outcome, but we're coming at this from outside the Japanese cultural imaginary, and we're 40 years removed from that socio-political moment. So it's retrofuturistic. Like, is this the future according to the past? This might be the future according to a certain reading of the past.
But I think it is kind of grounded in this idea that the earth will heal itself, and it has mechanisms for that.
Yeah.
Anyways, I don't really care what other Solarpunks decide on this one, as a Solarpunk movie, not Solarpunk movie, because in the great cosmic ohmic kind of scheme of things, it doesn't actually really matter. But I am standing my ground on the fact that there, as yet, has never been a Solarpunk feature film. So sure, Nausicaä and many of the other Studio Ghibli films are Solarpunk-esque, or Solarpunk adjacent, or explore a lot of what are Solarpunk themes, but they don't follow the conventions of a Solarpunk story. Does that matter? Again, not really. Should that stop anyone from writing more stories or making more films like these? Absolutely not. But someday I would like to watch an intentionally Solarpunk feature film.
Me too. I've heard good things about Disney's Strange World, actually, so maybe we should try to tackle that one at some point.
Oh, okay. I've not even heard of that. Disney's not really my thing, I have to say.
I don't think it was very well marketed either. Like it just kind of came out of nowhere, it seems like, and certainly wasn't marketed as being solar punk, but apparently it, ticks off a lot of the boxes.
Okay. Opening up questions like, can anything produced by that sort of juggernaut ever be considered truly solarpunk art? Especially when that juggernaut has a reputation for not properly paying their artists.
Can the art be separated from the artist? That's a whole other discussion to have.
At least it sounds like we're both on the same page when it comes to whether or not Nausicaä is solarpunk.
We're a very firm kinda.
Yeah, exactly.
So, like, while Nausicaa has a lot of solarpunk themes and imagery in it, the film is at best proto-solarpunk. It's more of a post-apocalyptic genre story, the plot focusing more on that original apocalyptic moment and less on the lifestyle and values of the people of the Valley of the Wind. Though that is what saves them from Omatak in the end, it's still more of a single savior narrative.
But an incredibly enjoyable film.
Oh, yeah, I think we both agree about that.
And I think that's a good place to leave this discussion then. There's tons more that could be said about Nausicaä though. But listeners, have you seen Nausicaä of the Valley of the Wind? What did you think? Is it solarpunk to you? And why is that? I mean, is it a solarpunk film? Is it solarpunk adjacent?
Yeah.
Do tell.
Please tell us. And yeah, until next time,
Stay solarpunk. Woo! Thank you for listening to Solarpunk Presents, a podcast hosted and produced by Ariel Kroon and Christina de la Rocha.
The audio for this episode was recorded in part on the traditional territory of the neutral Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples.
And in Germany. The opening and closing music for this podcast is Water Cooler Gang by Monkey Warhol, available for use under the Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International License.
Don't forget to support us on Patreon at patreon.com/solarpunkpresents.
Every little bit helps us keep bringing you discussions and interviews.
Until the next episode, keep dreaming.
And stay solarpunk.